I think most of you know who I am. I'm Dr. Joseph Knippenberg. I teach politics here at Oglethorpe. This is the third and final lecture in our series on constitutionalism and the Constitution between populism and cosmopolitanism. I'm grateful to the Jack Miller Center for sponsoring this mini-conference / lecture series, and I'm grateful to those of you who have shown up at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon to hear our final speaker. I promise you he'll be worth it. I'm happy to introduce my old friend, David Alvis, who is an associate professor of political science at Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Professor Alvis received his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Dallas and his Ph.D. from Fordham University in New York. You wrote your dissertation on Herbert Crowley, didn't you? Who was one of the founders of that once great journal of opinion called The New Republic. Professor Alvis, another claim to fame, so to speak, was that for a couple of years he taught at Oglethorpe. This is 20 some odd years ago now. He's gone on to great things since then. The author or co-author of a couple of books, one on, let's see if I can read my tiny print here, The Contested Removal Power from 1789 to 2010, and another book, Statesmanship and Progressive Reform. He's also been at work for some time on something on Dante, right? And is it every summer you teach in Italy? Every summer he goes to, he's my idol, what can I say? I'd love to do that. Without further ado, join me in welcoming Professor David Alvis.
Well, I really appreciate it. This is actually a huge crowd for 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon in an undergraduate institution. So first of all, I'm very grateful to everyone who showed up. And also too, I'm really honored to come back and give a talk at the institution where my teaching career began about 20 years ago. And I guess 20 years is enough if they've actually forgotten all the bad things that I did and finally invited me back to the college. So I'm proud to be here. Oglethorpe, you've changed a lot over the number of years. Students used to be discouraged from ever going out the back gate of the college. That was considered a dangerous neighborhood right in that area. Now I look at it, I obviously can't afford to buy a house in that neighborhood. I've changed a lot as well, not for the better, but when I first started teaching here, I wasn't old enough to rent a car. Now I own 5, though I had to rent a car to get here because none of my children would loan me one. But it's also, too, even though geographically I've moved far away from Oglethorpe, on the other hand, it's a place that I've never moved beyond. I've taught at a lot of institutions since I taught here. And when I taught here, I taught predominantly in the core. I taught narratives of the self, human nature and the social order, historical perspectives. I asked to teach the science class, but they said you have to actually be qualified to do that. So I had an incredible opportunity to teach in the core here, and I have never taught in an institution that had a coherent education like you find at Oglethorpe. It's a very, very sophisticated education, and it's one that is embodied by its alumni. It's just extraordinarily intellectually sophisticated people who have an understanding of how ideas in the world fit together. And so while I've been in many places that have actually tried to put together a coherent program, the nature of the faculty at most institutions are just not capable of developing the kind of sophisticated curriculum that you have here. So I miss that a great deal. My colleagues have spoken today on the popular nature, I think, of democracy and the importance of people, of its people, sustaining democratic life. I'd like to end by talking about how the elite are the group that sustains democratic life, and I'd like to talk about the elite of the elite, and that is lifetime judges. And so my talk is going to be on the court's judicial review and the rule of law, and I particularly want to focus on a famous case that hopefully everyone has heard of at least, and potentially familiar with, and that is the case of Marbury v. Madison. When we think of the court, we tend to idealize an institution that stands outside of the political sphere, one that renders verdicts free of prejudice or political passion. Judges are the umpires. They wear their black robes, which indicates, right, that their judgments are not colored. They sit upon a raised dais, perched high above the disputants that come before them. And and Lady Justice greets at the threshold visitors to the court wearing her famous blindfold. And though perhaps our assessment of the court's impartiality at any time is inevitably tinged by our own political leanings, our standard of measure is always of an institution that is set apart from political passion and individual favoritism. Of course, this idealized portrait of the court now seems a bit quaint. Following the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade this summer, skepticism of the court's capacity for impartial judgments has become the norm, as we now hear increasing calls for court packing and other political reforms of the judiciary. And even though the decision put the issue of abortion squarely back in the realm of democratic politics, the Dobbs opinion has been cast as an affront to majority will, an opinion authored by a court composed of justices who are out of touch with the interests of the people. Regardless of who is making the argument, the politicization of the judiciary is generally thought to be a recent development in American politics. The court, as the story goes, was once a place highly regarded for its apolitical objectivity, until at some point the institution was derailed by activist judges who diverted the court from its original purpose. How recent that is a matter of dispute. For some, it started with the liberal Warren Court. Others, it began with the politicization of Senate judicial nomination hearings. And for others, it began with the recent Trump appointments, culminating this year in the Dobbs decision. In truth, these concerns about a politicized judiciary are really not new at all. They did not begin with Trump's nomination of judges or with the court's decision in Roe. Rather, they go all the way back to the adoption of the Constitution and its provision for an independent judiciary. And one of the most famous criticisms of the proposed Constitution, the anti-federalist Robert Yates, pseudonym was Brutus, right, predicted in 1788 that the following would become the practice of the federal courts. He said, "In their decisions, they will not confine themselves to any fixed or established rules, but will determine according to what appears to them the reason and the spirit of the Constitution. The opinions of the Supreme Court, whatever they may be, will have the force of law, because there's no power provided in the Constitution that can correct their errors or control their adjudications. From this court there is no appeal, and I conceive the legislature themselves cannot set aside a judgment of this court because they are authorized by the Constitution to decide in the last resort." So, armed with the authority to interpret rather broadly worded Constitution, these unelected, unremovable judges, according to Brutus, would use that power to advance their own political agenda at the expense of popular will. Judicial review, coupled with their lifetime tenure protections, would render federal judges, in the words of Brutus, independent of the people, of the legislature, and of every power under heaven. Men placed in this situation will generally soon feel themselves independent of heaven itself. In terms that echo today's critics of the court, Brutus feared that an elite body of judges would be empowered by Article 3 to subvert our democratic government. Now, in response to the criticism of anti-federalists like Brutus, Alexander Hamilton, Federalist, in Federalist 78, offered the idealized portrait of the court that has come to define the standard by which we typically judge the judiciary. In order to remain impartial, judges would require lifetime tenure. Only when they were free from the pressure of democratic politics would judges serve the vital purpose of upholding the Constitution against attempts by Congress or the President to enlarge the powers beyond the agreed limits. Contrary to the anti-federalist charges, Hamilton argued that this arrangement was actually quite democratic. He says, "Nor does this conclusion by any means suppose a superiority of the judicial to the legislative power. It only supposes that the power of the people is superior to both, and that where the will of the legislature, declared in its statutes, stands in opposition to that of the people, declared in the Constitution, the judges ought to be governed by the latter rather than the former. They ought to regulate their decisions by fundamental laws rather than those which are not fundamental. The will of the people is fundamentally embodied in their social contract, in the Constitution, and not in the transient desires of some temporary majority. Hence, judicial review, according to Hamilton, is not antithetical to democracy, but actually an essential means by which it is preserved." Even though the Federalists won the day, I think there's something actually in this argument to be said for both sides in the exchange. I mean, Hamilton is right when he observes that without an independent judiciary shielded from political pressure by the provision of lifetime tenure, there's simply no way to check majority will when it transgresses the limits set by the Constitution. To rely on Congress to prevent the abuse of legislative power would be like entrusting each side in an athletic contest to serve as their own officials. On the other hand, Brutus seems to have anticipated better the realities of judicial decision-making today. Senate confirmation hearings today appear to vindicate the anti-federalist concern that even the umpires are people, and people tend to be guided by their own interests. The argument between one question I wanted to explore here is there a way to reconcile the arguments, right, of Hamilton and Brutus? In other words, the need for an independent judiciary with some means of checking that independent judiciary. Is there a means by which the people can check the judges when they err in their application of the law or abuse that authority? Chief Justice Hughes' famous quip about the court would suggest that there's actually no solution. He famously said that the court is not final because it is infallible, but it is infallible because it is final. I disagree with Justice Hughes. There is a solution, but not one that's easily found in the Constitution. Rather, a very ingenious solution can be found in the case most famously associated with judicial review, and that is Marbury v. Madison. If the goal of the judiciary was to present itself as an institution that transcended politics, Marbury v. Madison was a very, very inauspicious start to that project in 1803. The case was so deeply mired in politics that it's nothing short of miraculous that it has come to be the cornerstone today of the judiciary's dignity. Yet I think by getting at the truth behind the myth of Marbury, we see the relationship between politics and law really is, and how the court comes to gain a reputation for objective decision-making. So the case began following one of the most nasty and acrimonious elections in American history. So in 1800, the Jeffersonians decisively defeated the Federalists, winning the presidency, the Senate, and the House. And this wasn't just kind of your normal political contest between two political parties. Rather, at least from Jefferson's perspective, this was a battle to save our democratic nation from a monarchist cabal led by the Federalists that was undermining the entire revolution of 1776. In fact, speaking of the Federalist Party, Jefferson wrote to a friend, "I wish nothing but their eternal hatred. If that evidence of my conduct were to cease, I should become suspicious to myself. But between the monarchists and the Federalists, I draw a clear line. The latter is a sect Republican, the former is implacable enemy." In Jefferson's mind, the majority of the Federalists needed to be driven into an abyss from which they will never return, which he actually succeeded in doing in the election of 1800. Desperate to save themselves and their country from the political heresies of Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, the Federalists looked for ways to entrench themselves in the national government during their remaining days in office. And lucky for them, right, the lame duck period of the presidency and Congress lasted much longer back then than it does now. So offices didn't change until the following March. And the Federalists were keenly aware that they weren't particularly popular with voters. So they needed to find a place, right, where they didn't really need to cultivate popular support. Naturally, the judiciary turned out to be the most amenable location. So John Adams nominated Federalist John Marshall to the position of Chief Justice. And in February, the Federalist Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, creating 6 new circuits in the federal judiciary, along with 16 new justices. And the act was actually a much-needed reform of the system because the judges on the Supreme Court would also have to ride all the circuit courts and hear cases. It was a burdensome responsibility that strained the court much too far, so they actually did need this. But the thing is that it was very clearly done for partisan purposes, and that was to create offices where the Federalist judges could be appointed, and from there they could strike down the actions taken by a Jeffersonian legislature or the executive. And then for good measure, the act also reduced the size of the Supreme Court, denying Jefferson a Supreme Court appointment during his presidency. So in the end, whatever the merits of the bill were, its virtues were vastly overshadowed by its obvious partisan gaming. Jefferson immediately realized the portents of the Federalist legislation for the future of his own administration. He said, "The Federalists have retired into the judiciary as a stronghold, and from that battery, all the works of republicanism are to be beaten down and erased." Jefferson's congressional ally in Congress, William Branch Giles, wrote, "What concerns us most is the situation of the judiciary as is now organized. The revolution of 1800, the election, is incomplete as long as that strong fortress is in possession of the enemy. And it is surely a most singular circumstance that public sentiment should have forced itself into the legislative and executive, and that the judiciary should not only not acknowledge its influence, but should pride itself in resisting its will under the misapplied idea of independence. No remedy is competent to redress the evil system, but an absolute repeal of the whole judiciary, and terminating the present offices and creating a new system, defining the common law doctrine and restraining to the proper constitutional extent the jurisdiction of the courts." So the Jeffersonians weren't going to take these Federalist shenanigans lightly. In fact, Jefferson not so subtly said in his first inaugural, "The judiciary system of the United States, and especially that portion of it recently erected, will of course present itself to the contemplation of Congress." Almost immediately, Congress set to work, repealing the Federal Judiciary Act of 1801, regardless of its much-needed reform of the circuit courts, and the questionable constitutional validity of removing federal justices who had been appointed to their offices. The repeal also had the effect of punishing the justices of the Supreme Court by forcing them to return to the odious task of riding the circuits. And then, Congress finally, for good measure, canceled the first term of the Supreme Court in 1802 and just prevented them from being able to meet at all. Then finally, the Federalists began to contemplate the possibility of reforming the court so that it can no longer wield the power of judicial review. In fact, the Repeal Act of 1802, where they repealed this Judiciary Act of 1801, was just the first shot across the bow of the courts. For many of the Jeffersonians in Congress, this legislation concerning the courts was not an attempt to correct a few Federalist wrongs, but a much broader effort to quelch the authority of the courts to pass judgment on the acts of Congress and the President. When some members of the House suggested that the repeal legislation might have the unintended effect of undermining the court's ability to review the constitutionality of statutory law by making the court subservient to Congress, the subsequent debate reveals that many Jeffersonians aim to do exactly that, undermine the courts and make it subservient to Congress. And in fact, Jefferson himself, echoing the lines of Brutus, explained, "You seem to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of constitutional questions, a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. Our judges are as honest as other men, and not more so. They have with others the same passions for party, for power, and the privilege of their courts. Their power the more dangerous as they are in office for life and not responsible, as the other functionaries are, to elective control. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal, knowing that to whatever hands confided with the corruption of time and party, its members would become despots. It has more wisely made all the departments co-equal and co-sovereign with themselves." Thus, the Jeffersonians believed that they could save republicanism and prevent the rise of judicial supremacy in the United States by strangling judicial review in its infancy. The case of William Marbury, in contrast to all of these events, must not have seemed like much of an issue before the Supreme Court, particularly when there was a challenge to that Repeal Act of 1802 sitting on the court's docket by 1803. Marbury had been nominated by the President Adams and confirmed by the Senate as a justice of the peace in Washington, D.C., under what was called the Organic Act, which had been passed about the same time that the Federalists were pushing through the Judiciary Act of 1801. But despite the minor significance of the appointment, Marbury was the kind of target that the Jeffersonians would have to strike in order to vindicate their election claims in 1800. This was a revolution of the people in 1800. Marbury's loyalties are best explained by the name that he chose for his son. His son's name was Alexander Hamilton Marbury. Delivering a commission to an individual with those kind of Federalist credentials would have dampened the flame of the Revolution of 1800. And unfortunately for Marbury and other appointees, the Adams administration ran out of time to deliver all its new commissions when the Jeffersonian administration took over. Apologize. There's no evidence what happened to the commissions, though I doubt it's much of a mystery. So I imagine, when they walked into the office, when Jefferson walked into the office and found all of these commissions that had been undelivered by the Adams administration, I imagine that he simply tossed them into the fire, despite the fact that the individuals, had been nominated by the former president and confirmed by the Senate. Now, Marbury didn't have a lot of time to find a remedy for his problems, especially through the federal court system. His tenure as a justice of the peace in Washington, D.C. was only for a period of 5 years. And if he had attempted to go through the normal process of petitioning the lower federal courts, he probably would have found his case entangled with the appeals process for so long that his case would eventually just become moot. And so therefore they would have never heard the case. And he also wouldn't have gotten any back pay for his position as a justice of the peace. Marbury, however, found a different venue. Under a provision of the Judiciary Act of 1789, this famous section referred to as Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, where he claimed, this is questionable interpretation of the law, that the court had been given original jurisdiction to issue a writ of mandamus to anyone who wanted a judicial order against a federal official. So in case you're not used to this kind of legal speak, here's the simple issue. There's two ways you get to the Supreme Court. One is through the appeals process. Either you start like a lower federal court and appeal up eventually to the Supreme Court, or from the highest state court up to the Supreme Court. That's called appellate jurisdiction. And then there's what's called original jurisdiction, where you go straight to the Supreme Court. You don't have to pass through all those lower levels. Marbury was in a big time crunch. He needed to get this decision and get it quick, and so he found this Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 that allowed him to go straight to the Supreme Court and asked for this writ of mandamus. A writ of mandamus is just an order to a government official to carry out a responsibility or duty that they have. So in this case, he would like his commission as a justice of the peace in Washington, D.C. So the events that followed revealed the really high regard at this time in American history for the judiciary. The first order of business was to actually prove that Marbury had a commission at all. When the court requested the Senate to send over records as evidence, the Jeffersonian or the Democratic-Republican-controlled Senate simply refused to hand over the confirmation report, because now they controlled the Senate rather than the Federalists. So they simply refused to give any record that he actually had been confirmed by the Senate. Next, the court subpoenaed the Secretary of State for Jefferson, who has the responsibility of delivering these commissions, James Madison, who simply refused to show up to oral arguments at all. They also asked the State Department to provide relevant documents, a request that Jefferson's State Department declined to accommodate. Now, of course, it would have been rather obvious to anyone that the best witness in the case would be the person responsible for delivering the commissions in the first place. That is John Adams, Secretary of State. And you would assume that a Federalist Secretary of State would be much more amenable to appearing before the court to offer testimony. Unfortunately, that individual was otherwise detained, as it was none other than the sitting Chief Justice himself, John Marshall. Marshall had been one of Adams' most trusted aides, a loyal Federalist who helped promote almost every policy that Jefferson attacked the administration for in the election of 1800. One benefit, though, for Marbury's lawyer is that he didn't really have to prove the evidence that there was a commission, since the presiding justice in the case already knew that he had one. Not only was the case deeply mired in politics from the start, but any decision in the case would have to confront a whole host of political dilemmas in the aftermath. If Marshall were to issue an order to the Jefferson administration to deliver the commission, the court would find itself reeling from the embarrassment of having the executive just simply ignore the request from the court, thereby showing the court simply powerless to do anything. Having already refused a subpoena and a request for evidence, there's no doubt that the Jefferson administration would have just ignored the judicial order. Given the fact that the court's reputation was initially weak to begin with, this would have probably put the nail in the federal judiciary, in the coffin of the federal judiciary. On the other hand, denying Marbury's request for the writ would have probably had the same result, since many would think that the Supreme Court had just caved to political pressure. For the future of an independent judiciary, the case appeared, at least for Marshall, to be a lose-lose situation. Marshall's decision miraculously turned a lose-lose situation into a win-win situation for the court. As most of us know, Marshall denied Marbury's petition for a writ of mandamus, thus avoiding the embarrassment of having the court's writs snubbed by the executive. But at the same time, he managed to rebuff the larger Jeffersonian efforts to subvert the court's power to review the actions of another branch of government by declaring the congressional statute under which Marbury had applied for a writ of mandamus unconstitutional. The Jefferson administration's desire to avoid giving Marbury his commission forced them to at least appear to acknowledge the court's authority to exercise the power of judicial review against another branch of government. And given that much of the opinion reiterates Hamilton's case for judicial review in Federalist 78, Jefferson's acceptance of the result appeared to imply approval of judicial review as an original constitutional power of the judiciary, and to acknowledge the court's authority to review the actions of another branch of government. The fact that Marshall turned a lose-lose case into the cornerstone of the judiciary's authority to say what the law is constitutes one of the most remarkable achievements of political statesmanship in American history. I say that knowing well the problem that it raises. The orthodox theory of American constitutionalism, supposedly embodied in the case of Marbury v. Madison, insists that the political game needs a neutral umpire to apply the rules. Yet the fact that this case required political gamesmanship to achieve that reputation suggests that the court is not really a passive observer or even a neutral umpire. The rule of law, in other words, actually requires human beings with a particular virtue and capacity for judgment. And this judgment isn't just one of narrow legal considerations, but of political ones as well. Ironically, then, the case that has come to be identified with the court's transcendent status above politics owes its decision to one of the greatest political maneuvers in judicial history. But perhaps more importantly, it's a reminder to judges at all times that the court's reputation for impartiality is not something that can be merely assumed, but has to be actually earned through political management. Now, while most people today, enamored by the prestige of Marbury, might overlook the political machinations of the case, it couldn't have escaped Marshall that future judges could only preserve the reputation of a fragile court if they were properly incentivized to think politically, not just legally. I don't think Marshall overlooked this concern. Rather, I think he made a provision for it in one of the most underappreciated and innovative parts of the decision. So Marshall's explanation for the unconstitutionality of that Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, it's usually received either little attention from scholars who study this, or the scholars who do look at it mock it as just an absolutely terrible legal decision, that there's no way that this law should have been considered unconstitutional. So why, according to Marshall, in this opinion, was Congress wrong when, in 1789, it supposedly gave the court original jurisdiction to issue a writ of mandamus? So here's the legal argument by Marshall. It's a little bit technical. But it says the following, right? It's the following. According to Marshall, the statute, that Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789, with its constitutional, the statute, right, according to Marshall, violated the constitutional provision for original jurisdiction that you find in Article 3, Section 2. Now here's what Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution says. In all cases affecting ambassadors, other foreign public ministers, foreign consuls, and those in which a state shall be a party. So if you're an ambassador, foreign public minister, or consul, or a state, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction for those parties. But then it goes on. So part of the argument is Marbury is not a state, he's not a foreign ambassador, he's not a foreign public minister, he's not a foreign consul. And those are the parties that have original jurisdiction. But it goes on to say, in all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction. So if you're not one of those parties, you're going to have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact. In other words, you'd have to make your way to the Supreme Court from starting from the lower courts and working your way up, both as to law and as to fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as Congress shall make. Let me read that second sentence just one more time. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as Congress shall make. So here's Marshall's reading, right? According to Marshall, the clear line between the original and the appellate jurisdiction of the court in the Constitution is meant to be firm. You can't transgress that line. There's original, there's appellate, and the Constitution is clear about who has what. And so Marshall says in the case, if it has been intended to leave it in the discretion of the legislature to apportion the judicial power between the supreme and the inferior courts according to the will of that body, that is the legislature, it would certainly have been useless to have proceeded further than to have defined the judicial power and the tribunals in which it should be vested. The subsequent part of the section is mere surplusage. I don't entirely know what that word means, but I think excessive. It means simply unnecessary, right? Is entirely without meaning if such is to be the construction. If Congress remains at liberty to give this court appellate jurisdiction where the Constitution has declared that that jurisdiction shall be original, an original jurisdiction where the Constitution has declared it shall be appellate, the distribution of jurisdiction made in the Constitution is form without substance. In other words, to put this in simple English, if the Constitution was going to leave it up to Congress to make take some cases, right, that are appellate, make them original jurisdiction, in some cases they're original jurisdiction and make them appellate, if that was the intention, then you didn't need to draw a line between them in the Constitution. In other words, you didn't need to say, right, under the Constitution that in cases involving foreign ambassadors, foreign consuls, right, foreign ministers, or if a state is a party, they shall have original jurisdiction. That was just totally unnecessary, right? If it was totally up to Congress to be able to determine, right, whether or not you're going to have, the court shall have original jurisdiction or appellate jurisdiction. So Marshall's argument is that Congress cannot make anything original appellate, and anything appellate they cannot make into original. And so this is why Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional. It took a case that would normally go up through appeals, and it gave the Supreme Court original jurisdiction to hear that case. Marshall's argument is you can't do that. You can't make something appellate into original. You can't make something original into appellate. Part of that argument seems like a plausible reading of the Constitution, and that is the Constitution is quite specific about what is original jurisdiction, and that is all cases affecting ambassadors, foreign public ministers, and consuls, and those in which a state shall be a party. But Marshall seems to overlook one very basic thing that's in the next line of the Constitution. It says, in all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and to fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as Congress shall make. What do you do with the exceptions clause? The Constitution says Congress can make exceptions. And Marshall says, oh, no, they can't. But then why do you have an exceptions clause? That would seem to be surplusage, right, as he uses that term. In other words, right, it might make sense from one perspective on the Constitution that you can't take something that's original and make it appellate. You can't say, okay, when it comes to cases involving ambassadors, right, now they're going to be appellate. Okay, can't do that. But why can't you take some cases, right? Why wouldn't you read the exceptions clause as implying that you could take some appellate cases and make them original? And that's exactly what Congress probably thought it was doing in 1789 when it allowed for an individual to go straight to the Supreme Court in its original jurisdiction and ask for this writ of mandamus. It's a very efficient way, and they read the Constitution and said we can make exceptions, and therefore we can make some things appellate, some things that would be appellate into original. We just can't make things that are original into appellate. That would be a much more natural reading of the Constitution. It would be a much more natural reading of the Constitution because if that's not the case, then what's the point of the exceptions clause in Article 3, Section 2? What change can you make? So if you do this, you play we'll play a Marshall game. Right? It's not a great game, it's a Marshall game. Right? If I tell you, right, I'm going to give you a bowl with blue chips. Right? And so blue chips, right, go in the blue chip bowl. And then I say, and red chips go in the red chip bowl, subject to whatever exceptions and regulations you shall make. Think about what you would make as a change. The most obvious change would be, I think I'm going to take some red chips and put them in the blue chip bowl. You might even put blue chips in the red chip bowl. Maybe that's questionable, but you definitely, I mean, what the hell else are you going to do? What could the exceptions clause mean? Now, if you're playing that game with Marshall, Marshall would say, oh, you can't do that. You can't put the red chips in the red chip bowl, and the blue chip bowl. And you can't put the blue chips in the red chip bowl. And you're like, well, then what's the exceptions clause mean? What kind of changes can I make? And this is Marshall's answer. There's another category. We'll call it the floor. You can't put the red chips in the blue chip bowl, and you can't put the blue chips in the red chip bowl. The only change that you can make is to take the red chip bowl and pour it on the ground. I would never play games with Marshall, right? That just doesn't sound like fun at all. But that's exactly how he's reading Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution. He's saying, right, you can't, right, move something from appellate to original. You can't move something from original into appellate. So what changes can Congress make? And the answer is Congress can make only one change, and that is it can strip the federal courts of their ability to hear certain cases on appeal. Now, I have my doubts about whether or not that's a great reading of the Constitution. And while I find Marshall's interpretation of Article 3, Section 2 a bit of a stretch, it's actually an ingenious solution to the problem of judicial review. So remember, we talked about the problem between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right, over the notion of judicial review. On the one hand, you need umpires in the game, right? On the other hand, the Anti-Federalist point is umpires are people, and people can be motivated by their political interests and their individual passions. And it doesn't seem like there's any solution to that. Especially right when you have you have to have lifetime judges so that they can resist democratic pressure. Is there a way that we can have an impartial judiciary with lifetime tenure, capable of resisting democratic pressure, but in the worst of circumstances, if the court goes to some extreme, we can do something about it? And Marshall's funky interpretation of Article 3, Section 2 offers an answer. Here's what you can do. If you find the Supreme Court's decision so egregious that it offends society to a great extent, then what you can do is you can ask your representative to strip, right, the Supreme Court of its ability to hear these cases, these particular issues on appeal. So take, the issue you're most worked up about in terms of how the court has decided it. You can turn to your representative and say, strip the court of its ability to hear cases on that issue in the future. And in some ways you can imagine, right, that's something you're not going to do every day because it would undermine the integrity of the judiciary, and it takes a lot of political capital to do it. But in another sense, right, it is something, right, that the judges always have to think about. Every Supreme Court case that exercises judicial review will always forever have to cite the case of Marbury v. Madison. And that means every judge continually has to think politically. They have to think, if I go too far, I'll have my power of appellate review stripped from me. And given the fact that 99.5% of cases come to the Supreme Court on appeals, that matters. So while I find Marshall's interpretation a bit of a stretch, it's an ingenious solution to the problem of judicial review. If judicial decisions go too far astray from what the people will stomach, the people's elected representatives can always strip the court of its appellate jurisdiction. While the solution allows for a legislative majority to check the court, it does not undermine judicial review in the way that the Jeffersonians might have. As illustrated by its sparse use over the course of American history, Congress's power to strip the court of its appellate jurisdiction is one that is sparingly used precisely because the political stakes are so high. But it functions as a constant reminder to judges that whenever they wield the power of judicial review, they must consider the political ramifications of their decision, lest they have their appellate jurisdiction stripped from them. In the end, the courts appear to stand aloof from politics only when justices take account of the political ramifications of their decisions. While perhaps this is not the idealized court that we would like to imagine, it does acknowledge the realities, I think, of the rule of law. The rule of law works best when it is applied by human beings who exercise prudence and wisdom in its application. Thank you very much.